When it comes to international affairs, size matters. Let's be honest about that. Big countries with big populations, large militaries, and of course, sizable economies can exercise more influence on the international stage. But we also know that when it comes to foreign policy and international relations, but just as important is their strategies in terms of dealing with risks and challenges in the international system. It's about how you leverage your population, your resources, your military, your economy, and your diplomatic skills. That's why small countries like the United Arab Emirates or Singapore or even Switzerland exercise a lot of influence on the international stage. It's not about the size of their economy or their population, it's about the strategies that they deploy in order to make the most out of the international system. That is why we need to talk about a very important concept, strategic culture. To understand the concept of strategic culture, particularly in the context of the Philippines, we're going to talk to someone who is an expert not only in anthropology, but also in geopolitics. And by better understanding the Philippine strategic culture, we'll also be in a better position to navigate the rivalry between US and China, and also to ensure that we can get the most out for the Filipino people in a brave new world. Joining us tonight is UP Department of Anthropology Professor Dr. Chester Cabalza. Thank you very much, Dr. Cabalza, for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Richard.
Yeah,
it's an honor to be.
And the
Look
perfect timing, right?
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in the right costume, because I really wanted to talk about a number of issues that you have covered as a scholar and also as a prominent geopolitical analyst in the country. And one of those important concepts is strategic culture. Now, why is it important? Because we always talk about the big powers,
Right.
but we also know that there's smaller countries, including Singapore, or United Arab Emirates, etc., who are quite influential on the global level. And we know that has a lot to do also with how they approach their relations with the major powers and how they flex their muscle or whatever resources and assets they have. So I think the issue of strategic culture is very important because that may help us understand why the Philippines perhaps is sometimes underperforming or sometimes could do well beyond our immediate resources.
Okay.
And all. Yeah.
When we talk about strategic culture, it's the sum total of our ideas, our emotional aspirations and dreams as people and as a nation. Remember, during World War II, anthropologists played a major role. You have prominent American anthropologists who advised the American president not to dethrone the Japanese emperor at the time because they believed that the Japanese emperor is the symbol of the Japanese people, right? There's a reason why up to now you have the Japanese royalty and monarchy. And we have to thank anthropologists for their policy, advice, and contributions to scholarship, because at the time, one of the reasons why the US won the war because of the anthropologists also. They advised military people that in order for them to better understand Japan, you have to understand culture at a distance because they cannot go to Japan. So the best way to better understand Japan and the Japanese people is through culture. And that's where strategic culture came to be. And I think if we try to translate it today, what is the role of strategic culture with all the struggles of the Philippines right now in the West Philippine Sea and our relations with major powers, with China and the United States? I think culture will play a very major role because if we try to look at it, we've been colonized by superpowers. With Spain, the United States, Japan, they are all naval powers. If you don't understand their maritime culture, their geopolitical clout, then you cannot understand why they are behaving like this. That's the reason why in strategic culture, the reason why we have to understand their psyche, their behaviors, their actuations, because of strategic culture. I think that is the role of anthropologists in these skirmishes and geopolitical problems that we have right now in the world.
So you're saying that at some point the anthropologists became an essential part of American grand strategy, especially during the World War, which is, it can get more high stakes than that, right?
Maybe because that is the tradition of our discipline. Remember that anthropology was born because of all isms in the world, from colonialism, imperialism. Now you have separatism and terrorism because of anthropology, because we study people. And colonials also use anthropologists on their favor.
Right.
They sent them to Afghanistan, to their colonial states for them to better understand people and tribes. That's the reason why during the American period, our the father of anthropology and archaeology, H. Otebayor, they were sent in the Philippines to understand Filipino people. That's why you have lowland Christian groups, the Muslim, Aitas, and so on. We were divided into that. Although their discipline was into zoologies. As zoologists, they have to study taxonomy because they have to categorize people. And that's how anthropology started in the Philippines. We tried to box people.
Right.
And soon after...
Which creates its own troubles and problems, right? I mean, the whole Orientalist othering and all.
Yes, and also, of course, that issue on the-othering, the West versus the East.
Right.
And it's high time that we have these kinds of discourses right now, because as anthropologists, this is our contribution to the academia for us to better understand the people, society, because that's our niche, basically, in this current discourse right now.
Yeah, I mean, what you raise is very important because we had, very prominent scholars like, essentially Edward Said, for instance, who look at the role of anthropologists and social scientists in essentially enabling colonial projects, right? But that, of course, doesn't take away also from the good intentions behind a more scientific approach to understanding, not only humans, but also patterns of behavior and the unique attributes of different communities in different parts of the world and how it evolves over time. Now, I want to talk more about how did you stumble upon this whole strategic culture concept, because I mean you're an anthropologist and but what made you feel that it's important to understand strategic culture, especially in the context of the Philippines? Was there like a vacuum of scholarship or discourse? Because from my understanding, as someone who does journalism and also scholarship, I didn't hear the term strategic culture used as much in Philippine studies, particularly international relations of the Philippines. I mean, I heard it somewhere else, but not in the Philippine context. And I remember you were among the first few people who said, hey, we need to do something about it. Can you tell me a little bit about the background of your study?
Actually, I'm the third generation anthropologist in the defense and security sector in the Philippines. It was Eflan de Hocano, the prominent Filipino anthropologist who started it all. We have the National Defense College. He was one of the pioneering course directors in the Master in National Security Administration. It was a course catered to professionalize our military officers.
Right.
So it started from him, although his contributions was more on culture and society and so on. There was no strategic culture yet at that time. And then, of course, we have Professor Rolda, who continued the legacy of Eflan de Hocano. And then I was the third one who came in because I was inspired by the work of Eflan de Hocano.
Right.
Although, of course,
particular which works or
like the role of culture in the military, basically. So there was no studies yet on strategic culture. When I came in, I was the youngest faculty professor at the National Defense College at the time, and my niche was anthropology. So I was tasked to teach about the sociocultural dimension of national security. And then I took up my PhD in anthropology because that's needed for me to better enhance my my dissertation on strategic culture. At the time when I was taking my PhD, Scarborough Shoal in 2012
perfect timing,
started to become the hottest topic at the time. I finished my schooling in Beijing because I was sent by National Defense College to do a study there. And then I tried to study Chinese culture, language, and basically military diplomacy, because that was the grade that I got there. So when I came back, I thought that it would be nicer if my contribution to the academia would be on strategic culture. And that's where I came into thinking that the best way to do it is to write a dissertation about the West Philippine Sea. And I remember you were one of my respondents there. So that was the start of it. I was talking about strategic culture. Even the Department of Anthropology was not akin to that kind of dimension when we talk about anthropology of security, because it's very expansive, broad, and comprehensive. And I was one of those pioneering thinkers to open that kind of horizon. And then, of course, I taught political anthropology in UP for 13 years already, and I have disciples, students, of course, taking up political anthropology, where I teach
so it's like a kind of a robust subfield now.
And of course, although not all in the department would appreciate it because, of course, there is that component that we align too much with the military because maybe
there's a discomfort
right,
with the
right,
military-industrial complex.
of course,
all of
that's
that.
a discourse in UP itself.
Yeah.
And I think I was like trying to bridge to them that that's not the military that we know now. They have evolved, they have become professionalized now, and I think strategic culture has been part of their discourse now, of their narratives. And I've been teaching at the National Defense for like 15 years already. I mean, certainly that's my contribution to the defense and security sector.
And what were your findings when it comes to, for instance, the patterns and also in the evolution and changes in the AFP, Armed Forces of the Philippines, approach to national security?
Okay. Yeah. If you try to look at it, there is the story of the Philippine strategic culture is the story of our doctrines and strategies also. If you try to remember it, we are now shifting from internal security strategy or internal security operations, ISO, to territorial defense. And maybe because of our over-reliance with the Americans in the past, that's the reason why we nurtured so much our insurgency problem. We've been doing that for 5 decades already, although they're saying now that we have reached a certain strategic victory because within this year or in 2 years' time, we can already halt that problem on insurgency. That's the reason why even in our constitution, it was prescribed that the role of the AFP is for external defense. That's territorial defense. And that's the reason why we started to modernize the armed forces. Although what triggered the modernization was the external problem that we have with our giant neighbor.
Right.
That was the transition. And if you try to notice, the sons of the former presidents, like the President Benigno Aquino, and now you have Ferdinand Marcos Jr., they've learned the mistakes of their parents because they focus more on the internal security, on the insurgency. This time around, they try to modernize the armed forces, and they are akin to external defense. I think that was very prominent on their thinking on the foreign and security policy. If you try to digest it, you would see that they try to modernize the armed forces because of their intention to nurture and enhance our territorial defense. And I guess that was a strong contribution on the strategic culture of the Philippines.
In what ways is the transition happening? I mean, it's one thing to buy new armaments, right? It's one thing to release new defense papers, but at the, let's say, rank and file level, or at least at the level of emerging leaders in the AFP, what were your findings in terms? Is there because strategic culture is not static, right?
Right.
It shifts not only with circumstances but also with intentional ways of reinventing your approach to the world, right? So, what is the arc that you have noticed?
Very good. That is a very keen question because even amongst the AFP, their problem is to transform the organizational culture.
Right, exactly.
Even if you have good strategy and doctrine, if the system itself is problematic in terms of how to evolve
or invested in past patterns,
right, then that becomes a problem. But it seems like right now, because of the transition and the acquisition that we're doing with the defense material that we have right now, I think they're trying to acclimatize with that kind of change right now. And if you also notice, maybe because they are more professionalized now, unlike before. Or
can you explain what do you mean by professionalization? Because we always mention that, right? So this clearly goes back to the basic ideas. Samuel Huntington, for instance, right? The idea is, in democracies, the political leaders have objective control over the military, meaning through constitutional procedures or in accordance with the Constitution. Whereas you have a dictator or an autocrat when the control is more subjective, meaning that military is more beholden to the person in power, civilian in most cases, rather than them beholden to some sort of constitution. When you say professionalization in the context of Philippines, what do you mean by that? Is it the same? Or obviously, I can understand there's going to be also a dimension of observation of human rights, observation of the broader democratic process in the Philippines. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Because the AFP has gone through a lot over the past half a century, It's not only the martial lawyers, it's also the war in Mindanao. And then now we're in a kind of a post-Cold War era, and a new Cold War, some would say. It's a huge transition, and one of the good things that happened under President Duterte, in fairness to him, was kind of bringing the peace process to its denouement, right? Which is the Bangsamoro referendum and all. So tumultuous but also exciting times, right, for the AFP. Can you tell me about the arc of evolution of their strategic
I'd like to
culture?
begin with the role of education, because if you try to notice it, those who are taking the Master in National Security Administration, it was not a mandatory requirement before.
Right.
It was by choice. Those who are floated in their in their assignments, so they have they take that because of their status. But now it's a mandatory
For all the
for
servicemen,
for all officers to become a one-star general.
you have to go through that
You
training.
have to go through the training. So if the PMA is like the Alpha, the NDCP, the National Defense College, is like the Omega.
Right.
Because of course the highest military training is the Command and General Staff College.
Right.
But the highest degree that they could get so far in their career as military officers would be their education for the Master in National Security Administration. Although
Right.
they're equivalent also, because some of the officers are also studying abroad.
Right.
So you have to have equivalency also. But I guess because of that education
Interesting.
that helped to mold the minds of our leaders right now, those actually who are commanding the Balikatan exercises and the IRHAP's positions right now in the AFP.
What's there in the education? Because skeptical people will say, oh, maybe they just went through the process, tick the box, get the grade, move on. What values and what worldview is kind of instilled or imbibed with that kind of education that we're talking about?
I would like to share my experience there, because
please.
I was one of the youngest professors when I came in, and of course we tried to elaborate and expand the dimensions of their learning. We have the different dimensions of national security. We teach political, economic, socio-cultural, techno-scientific, environmental, and the military. Before, they only have 4 dimensions: the political, economic, socio-cultural, and the military. And then you have an add-on on environmental and techno-scientific, which is very different from the American perspective. Because in the US, if you study national security there, they only teach the diplomatic, informational, military, and economic.
Right.
So the construction of national security in Asia basically is more on comprehensive security.
Human security.
Right. That's the reason why they added 2 dimensions on techno-scientific and the environment, to have a holistic understanding on our national security. I think it helped a lot because once you graduate from the MNSA, and then of course you will retire at the age of 56 or 57, then you're still young.
Yep.
So what else can you do? Some of them are lawyers,
PhDs.
So they have to work with the government.
New chapter of their life. Yeah.
Meaning to say that they are now exposed. That's part of their professional training in the National Defense College. And aside from that, the evolution of the doctrines also, from internal security to external defense. Now we are performing that transition to have more robust territorial defense because of the acquisitions, massive acquisitions, and also because of the modernization program that we have.
And the threat, real threat
and
that we are facing on a daily basis.
That's the reason why you have to adapt. You know, one thing that made Vietnam one of the most powerful armed forces in Southeast Asia, during the time of Ho Chi Minh, they lost their war with the French. And he thought that there were 2 reasons why they lost: because of their ignorance to geopolitical surroundings,
landscape,
and because of their meek and weak foreign policy. That was the lesson. And then they had fought the French, and then the Americans. They became very successful.
This is North Vietnam, of course, we're talking
North
about.
Vietnam. So what I'm trying to drive at here is that we've learned a lot from our neighbors. And through education, we teach them strategies to thinking, because of course, the military are very thorough when it comes to their training on the military side. what we can offer to them is the civilian thinking and the national defense, because most of the professors there are from UP, are civilians. We have different niche of expertise.
Right.
Mine was anthropology, marrying national security.
Right.
And I was talking about strategic culture. That is something that I can offer to them. So you see, they broaden their horizons in terms of how they would understand the wide geopolitical spectrum.
And you see that in your interaction with the students, in their paper, etc.
Definitely.
I mean, of course, I can speak for myself on my very good experience. I mean, it's one of our guests in this show.
Of course. Sometimes I invite you
exactly,
the national
right.
defense. Of course,
Yeah.
during their they had debates. They had, of course, their traditional thesis writing.
Right.
And you see also the selection of the topics and themes in their thesis are responsive to the current geopolitical situations
Right.
and geoeconomic problems that we have in the country and in the region, in the world. So that's how adaptive they are, responsive to it, and maybe global in terms
Right.
of their perspective.
What I also want to talk about here is the security sector reform, the SSR. This is a very important thing, right? Especially after the fall of the dictatorship. And then, of course, especially during the Aquino administration, I think General Bautista back then, there was really a bayanihan, right? An effort to not only make them more modern in terms of their capabilities, but also in terms of their appreciation of democratic values or basic constitutional values and all. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because the reason why this is important is we saw, unfortunately, I mean, at least there have been concerns about, for instance, the Philippine National Police, that, you know, when it came to human rights and professionalization, the whole drug war kind of cast shadow of doubt over how effective SSRs were, right? But many would maintain that when it comes to the AFP, even in the toughest moments in recent years, they maintained that kind of above the fray, essentially, the Constitution, the people are the final, arbiter of what we should stand for, right? Not what a specific political leader at some point is saying, right? For me, it's important because personally, of course, I was among the first who argued that, the Armed Forces of the Philippines is the Armed Forces of the Philippines, not of the President of the Republic.
Of course. It should be apolitical.
Exactly. And my sense is, even in the toughest moments of politicization of the security sector, or at least attempts at politicization of security sector, let's just be honest about it, over the past decade, I felt that they held their line, at least far better. Like, the military refused to be part of the drug war. The military made it very clear on multiple occasions they're never going to forget their duty to defend the Philippine sovereign rights, even when you had a president who had very good relationship with China, some would say more than good relationship with China. So in fairness, I would say the AFP, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, did vindicate itself in terms of if there were any doubts about where it stands and how politicizable it is, right? Can you tell me about from an anthropology standpoint? What is your appreciation of the security sector reform impact and how the AFP has shown resilience in terms of its?
I think the turning point was during the martial law,
right?
Because of course they were persecuted in terms of how they projected and flexed their muscles at the time. But because
you
of
mean
that,
after the fall of dictatorship,
after the dictatorship, and then of course you have the people power and how we saw military adventurism in the military sector, because that was a defense mechanism for them to take control of the situation,
right? Because
they have a different niche of power, which others would see that they are the messiah, that perhaps they could offer better perspective and better reforms for the country, but part of the professionalization and education that we have been doing with the military education, I think that was also embedded in their curriculum and on human rights and international IHL, international humanitarian law.
Right.
So that has been part of their narratives, and of course, even those foot soldiers were exposed to those complex approaches and disciplines, basically to better appreciate human rights and IHL. And because of that, SSR initiatives by other international NGOs and other embassies, I think it helped a lot in the transition of the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And I think they are on the right track right now. They better appreciate these Western discourses. Basically, it's a global discourse also.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And now, if you try to look at the recent episode lately with the fiasco with the defense and military sector during this early administration of Marcos, when of course some were saying that
there was a reshuffling of
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Can we talk about it from a perspective of a scholar?
What I'm trying to tell you is that they have become more mature now.
Right.
I think
because there were a lot of talks about magkakakuya or ganon kasi tinanggal
and
si ganito.
Because of that maturity and professionalism,
right,
they were able to resist temptation,
right,
to do military adventurism. And I think because of their solid education and professionalism in the armed forces now, that helped them in a way to better pursue the national interests of the country and to become the protectors of the people. And that's good, basically.
Of course, what makes our military quite unique in the region is the degree to which it's tethered to America or to the Pentagon, right? In terms of its doctrinal approach, in terms of weapon systems, etc. How influential has that been in shaping the strategic culture of the AFP? Because I cannot think of any other. Thailand is supposed to be an ally of US, but we know it's nowhere close. In fact,
agree.
Good friends of ours from the Australian National University did a survey a few years ago that showed actually many officers in Thailand prefer to deal with PLA of China rather than America because of criticism of their human rights concerns, etc. I never saw that with the AFP. Based on my own scholarship, based on my own interaction with people in the security sector, can you tell us a little bit about that? How big is the Uncle Sam factor in shaping the strategic culture?
It's part of our strategic culture. Remember when the Commonwealth Act #1, that was the formation of the national defense and enabling a way for us to better understand intelligence, counterintelligence, foreign intelligence. That was part of the content of the national security and national defense at that time. So, meaning to say, everything that we know about national defense and national security in the Philippines is a carbon copy of what we have learned from the Americans.
Yeah.
So, in toto, all the provisions there are very American, basically. That's the reason why we could understand their language, their equations, their behaviors. That's part of strategic culture, basically. And because of our affinity with the American culture, in a way, even if we have a love and hate relationship with Washington, it seems like we have a soft heart for the US because of this kind of affinity that we have, this kind of shared culture and morals that we have, basically. So I guess
it's very unique. I mean, we're the only American colony in Asia, right?
And it becomes a threat also for us.
Yes. What are the risks of that? I mean, strategic dependency is something we keep on hearing, right? I mean,
right. That's the reason why some were saying, especially in ASEAN, sometimes they don't listen to the Philippines because they were saying that we are the shadow of the Americans.
Or deputy sheriff in ASEAN. That's how I put it. Like if Australia is deputy sheriff in Asia, we're the deputy sheriff in ASEAN.
In a way, it's true because of the affinity and the influence of America with us. 50 years in Hollywood, and even up to now, we have closeness with the Americans, with the US, because of our OFWs, Filipino community in the US. So you cannot detach our affinity with the United States. And even if you ask some of our relatives, for sure, all of us have relatives in the States, in the United States. So we cannot deny that fact. So what we are trying to drive at here is that China should better understand that, because right now, part of understanding culture is to know the heritage, the roots. And that has been part of our narrative, of our history, of our culture with the Americans. But of course, we cannot just disregard the Chinese, because prior to the coming of the Americans, the Chinese were already here. They fought with us in the Spanish War, in the American War, in the Japanese War. All throughout, they've been here. And of course, the pillars of our economy are the Filipino-Chinese. So they are part of our system, of our narrative, of our culture. So in a way, we are very unique as Southeast Asian, because you have, we are a magnet.
Philippine exceptionalism.
Philippine exceptionalism, because we are a magnet to many superpowers, to many naval powers. And I don't know why, maybe because of our geographical importance. Geography is very important right
now. But
are
we that as unique? I mean, the Thai have their own bamboo diplomacy.
Right.
The Indonesians are known for their own, Balinese pop. I mean, I think all of us in one way or another are kind of caught between the eagle and dragon, right? And I would say it's not just two elephants or eagle and dragon. There are all sorts of other major powers in the neighborhood. You have India emerging, you have Japan there, South Korea and Australia are getting their act
what
together.
is unique with the Philippines is our legal mind.
Right.
We're one of, I don't want to carry ourselves here, we're one of the brightest when it comes to giving ideas and advices in the region.
Because you have been drenched in the American thinking, which happens to be the global hegemon,
or
right?
maybe because
we have a natural advantage.
Maybe because our intellectuals were exposed to global
Western
ideas, Western culture, the Ilustrados, the Pensionados with the Spaniards, and of course with the Americans.
Ahead of a lot of our neighbors and all. But what is there? I mean, what is your observation? I mean, clearly there was an advantage that came with, you know, that kind of affinity and institutional linkages with the superpower of our era. But obviously, disadvantage was also so-called damage culture of dependency. Is there a way out of it, or have we been moving out of the shadow of Uncle Sam to kind of find our own purpose? Because I see a lot of that debate in Australia, for instance, how we can be our own guy, and they're so irritated with the deputy sheriff. Moniker that Mahathir of Prime Minister Mahathir throw out them. So they're very sensitive with that, and they're very particular about emphasizing no, Australia is for Australia, and Australia has its own words and its own mind. Are we moving in that direction, kind of like Australia and some of our neighbors?
Okay, 2 points. You discussed about damage culture dependency. I'm writing a book right now on undamaged culture, trying to debunk the arguments of the one who wrote
James Fallows,
James Fallows,
the speechwriter of Carter.
But if you try to look at it, the culture was not damaged, basically. It just so happened that we have a different political, economic situation at the time.
The institutions were also
problematic.
Which can be fixed. These are not eternal. These are not innate.
But the culture are just the same. We are still practicing performing it, basically. Dependency, it is evolving now. Because what I'm seeing right now, in the past we need the Americans. Now it's the Americans who need us. So it's the other way around now.
And we have other partners to deal with Japan, with Australia, with India.
And we have other options because China is there.
Right. And as I said, I mean, they're also the middle powers and others, Korea and others we can deal with, right?
I'm also.
But is China an option? I mean,
in a way.
How open do you think the armed forces of the Philippines is to be as close to China as it has been to US?
Try to look at the Second World War. Japan and the US were the foremost enemies at the time. But now they are the best of friends. We cannot predict the future. It may be today that China would be our aggressor. Maybe in the future it could be our best friend. It depends on how our leader, top diplomats, and military generals will maneuver and do their work.
But the reason I mean, Japan, you can perfectly understand why we're comfortable with Japan, because post-war Japan was essentially built an American image, right? I mean, so. And so there is a continuity between that, right? I mean, so my point is like, under what circumstances can you imagine the armed forces of the Philippines comfortable with China?
Completely different political system. Of course, it's different from, because of course the doctrine and the military material that we have right now is influenced by the Americans, basically. But as we see China flexing its muscles, becoming a global economic power, then we still do not know if China could become the superpower of the future because, of course, of what is happening right now in our backyard and in the Indo-Pacific region.
So you're saying that down the road, maybe US will leave the region because anyway, they're not a resident power in a sense.
In a way.
And China may learn its lessons and better deal with us as their...
And maybe because, of course, becoming the superpower is a destiny. We do not know if the US can maintain its status in the region or in the world, or China would replace the United States. But what we're trying to drive at here is that we have to be responsive. Remember what the Vietnamese had done in the past. For them to win the war, they had to be responsive to get acquainted to the geopolitical landscape and to have a stronger foreign policy. So that's how they adapt.
Adaptation.
And one of the key lessons in anthropology is adaptation. For you to survive, you have to adapt to your environment. And that is what we're doing right now. It's really a delicate balancing act between these two global powers. And we are sandwiched by these two global powers. It's inevitable for the Philippines to basically engage with these two superpowers, two capitals basically, And that's the reason why, if you notice, of course, our president went to Beijing in January.
Right.
Our president went to Washington twice already, and perhaps a state visit is in the offing.
Right.
So, and of course, China will do its best to lure the Philippines because they cannot afford to lose us. For the reasons that they still have unfinished business with the Philippines because of the Hague ruling.
Yeah.
They wanted to revert that kind of narrative. And for them to become a superpower, they have to be respected. Remember,
they shouldn't be seen as an outlaw rogue superpower.
Right.
Yeah.
Remember, it's the center of the universe.
Yeah.
You have that kind of behavior coming from China, so we cannot get rid of them.
You came up with the term Philippineization. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because we talk about Philippine exceptionalism, the unique circumstances of our strategic culture, our military own subculture, and its understanding of its place in the world, in the country's policy agenda. Can you tell us a little bit about what's this Philippineization all about? And I think you also suggest that there are parallels all around the world. I mean, obviously the term that the ization. I mean. We have a lot of idea about the Balkanization, right? The idea of that, Balkans in Southern Eastern Europe, some would say the best way to make certain regions more stable is just to separate them into cantons, essentially, right? So Bosnians, Albanians, Croats, and that, when you force them together and then there's a vacuum, that's where things go crazy. How is that similar to, where does the Philippinization come from? Because I'm familiar with Balkanization, but what about the Philippinization?
Balkanization there, but the inspiration was, it came from Finlandization.
Finlandization.
It's not different. It's different from Finlandization because if you remember in world history, the reason why parts of Finland was amputated because of the armistice with Moscow, with Russia, and because of other sad experiences with the Russians, basically. But in here, it's a different milieu because there's no world war. And then secondly, we had a hedging strategy, trying to, of course, lure Beijing and Washington. But at the same time, we're trying to step up our security infrastructure. We're doing modernization. In other words, we're not choosing any superpowers at the time. So for us to survive this kind of dilemma is to rise up with that kind of Philippinization, where while you're having economic rapprochement with Beijing and diplomatic clout with Washington, at the same time you have to foster your own national security infrastructure, which I think it has been done. It just so happened that our pivot to China was not successful in the past administration. That's the reason why we have to get out from that cycle. And I think that Philippinization is now manifested in the current administration, where you see a leader trying to balance everything, and of course, you're still geared towards that independent foreign policy. So we see more action than words this time around.
And how is it different from what a lot of our neighbors are doing, right? I mean, the idea of economy with China, security with US, in the meantime, build your own capabilities. Isn't that more or less what most of our neighbors are doing?
But the difference is that we have a Hague ruling. We have that's
and we're US treaty ally.
I think that was the strongest strategic culture of the Philippines. The lawfare. That was our
very legalistic approach, right?
Because of course our handicap with our military and economic capabilities at the time. So the only way for us to condone our giant neighbor is through the international legal instruments, and that's where we excelled most, and we have applauded our country for that. That's the reason why in that Philippinization stage, that was a good spotlight for the Philippines on how it can leverage to become a middle power. Because of course we've been named recently as a middle power, but what would be our contribution to the world or to the region, basically? That law, that lawfare, that Hague ruling was our major contribution.
Which gave, of course, also leverage to a lot of our neighbors, right? Vietnam can, threaten to sue China more credibly. Malaysia has invoked also that in many ways, even Indonesia. So, being middle power is not only about having a mid-sized population or economy, it's also about contributing to more constructive patterns of cooperation, right? It's about values sharing, it's about coalition building, it's about really helping peace and security. So I'm saying, like, we are not a small power. Our population is similar to Mexico, but no one says Mexico is a small country, right? So we're definitely the middle power. It's a question of how can we become a functional, effective middle power, and I think that's really what we're looking at. Now, the last thing I wanted to discuss with you, there's so much I want to discuss with you, but it's also because it's in light of the EDCA debate, right? And it just happens that, of course, we share a similar background from the north of the country. But mine is more Ilocos, but you're familiar more with...
I'm from Cagayan.
You're exactly Cagayan. And Cagayan, speaking of strategic culture, has provided us an, how should I say it, a kind of an alternative perspective on how Philippines can approach foreign policy, right? Particularly the current governor of Cagayan has been very vocal and has been getting a lot of international attention by saying the Philippines should never choose between these superpowers.
Maybe because he was not consulted in the first place. That's the reason why.
Can you tell us a little bit about it? So you have as an anthropologist and security sector expert, you have some knowledge about Cagayan. What's going on there? Because some people are saying, maybe this guy, that he has legitimate concerns. No one wants to be on the front line. His idea is that not in my own backyard, right? You want deterrence? Put the American bases in your province and then let's see, diba? And then the others would say like, is this really about the interests of the people or consultation, or is this because there are a lot of Chinese investments there, right? And this is really about, you go with the side that has the most investments or even more in your part of the world. What's going on there in Cagayan?
Okay, I have three
Defend your province and your governor.
Okay, well, of course, Cagayan is very strategic.
Especially now with the Taiwan issue, right?
The reasons why the Americans came to the Philippines because they wanted to trade with China, and that is the jump point would be Cagayan.
Interesting.
So you see a lot of Americans and even of course French and Polynesians, they went through to China with Cagayan as their backdoor.
Interesting.
Okay, that's the historical perspective. But the identification of the two EDCA sites, Lalo, it's a historical. It used
Can
to
we
be,
talk about those two sites? Because people talk about them as if they're like massive bases like Subic and Clark. They're not. They're just sites, right? Maybe there's like frog and flora and fauna. Because you have been there, right? Can you describe to us anong meron dyan?
I was there 2 days ago. I went home to my province and visited two of the EDCA sites that Cagayan hosts basically. Lalo is, of course, it's a historical town because prior to Tuguegarao becoming the capital, Lalo used to be the Nueva Segovia, Spanish period. And then, of course, you have an airfield there. And I've known from the people I've talked to, interviewed there, is that it came into being because of the PPP, public-private partnership. So 42%, I think, came from the government, and then 58% from the private. But most of the private are from our locals. That they told me. And then, of course, you have Santa Ana. Santa Ana should be like the Subic of Cagayan. Because you have the Cagayan economic zone there.
Like, is it like as good as Subic in terms of ability to accommodate big ships, giant ships? Because it's topography, right?
Yeah.
It's not just having nice fancy asphalt there. It's really about, can the big giant vessels come there and park, as in
Right
Subic?
now, it's a small naval base, but in terms of its capability to of course, berth
the big
vessels and the submarines, they could do that. And
so the topography is right.
The topography is right. Even Lalo, because Lalo is an international airport.
The
size is 200 hectares.
Oh, it's huge. Yeah.
That's equivalent for an international airport. So they have the requirements to host modern vessels and
modern aircrafts too.
Basically. So we have that. But the problem there is the proposal for socioeconomic programs. Because if you only have the EDCA sites there as it is for defense use, the people are still hungry. Because in that part of the region, of the province,
so it's
going
to
be well developed.
It will crowd out, civilian investments.
Right.
It will be like a militarized zone.
And I was told that the mayor of Lalo is pro-EDCA. unlike the one in Santa Ana, he's against it.
Okay, so there are also divides within the LGU level.
The LGU is polarized also. But,
Interesting.
I think the problem there is how you would also teach them the concept of national security. Because perhaps one of the reasons why the local leaders, particularly the governor was resisting about the EDCA sites because of the negative perceptions about the EDCA sites. But once you have embedded to them the notion of national security, where you have different dimensions of national security: political, economic, socio-cultural, techno-scientific, environmental, and the military, then they would appreciate it.
The reason I want to ask is this. I mean, I think the claim that this is provocative towards China is very debatable. And I think sometimes it sounds like, okay, this sounds like talking points from China, right? But the idea that this could potentially crowd out investments, civilian investments, tourism, etc., because it's a militarized zone, maraming exclusion zone. I'm not sure you can do like a vlogger drone in an area where there's EDCA, right? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, on that issue, I find that interesting. I think that that's a legitimate point to be raised. Nevertheless, you have the case of Subic, right? Which massive military exit, but also big. I mean, I'm not endorsing the bad things that happened there for sure, but I'm saying like Subic went hand in hand, militarization, but also massive civilian economy there, right? I'm not talking about only entertainment, FedEx, etc. Like, so I'm just not sure it's as mutually exclusive, right? I mean, can't America, through its investments in this EDCA sites, actually help spur a whole community-wide economy there? Like,
that's what
can't
they're
you
rating,
put
basically.
them together? Is it? Yeah.
That's what they are rating Cagayan, because of course Subic and Tark are overcrowded, overdeveloped already. Then you have other EDCA sites that have high potentials for economic investments. I think Santa Ana through the CESA, and of course Lalo Airfield is still under the CESA.
Right.
They can of course become the best alternative for these economic investments coming from the Americans or from other parties out there. Although some were saying that the Chinese already came in, because of course you have casinos also there.
Right.
And
to what degree is that influencing what's happening? Like the
heard,
pool of the Chinese investments.
I heard that they will open the flight from Cagayan to Macau in the coming
So that's
months.
very casino. That's very online casino. I mean, that's
basically.
Oh,
but of
wow.
course, beyond that, it's the other economic developments should come in. We have good international airport there.
Right, I've heard about that. Very good, yeah.
International aircraft. And then, of course, you have naval base also in Santa Ana that could, of course, offer alternative than Subic. Then so be it.
And the need to also have domain awareness in the other side. I mean, we always talk about West Philippine Sea. What about the Philippine Sea? Benham Rise, right?
I agree. You have Gamu in Isabela.
Exactly.
I think that's the reason why they were identified.
This is not about Taiwan alone. I mean, there's the Philippine Sea we have to protect, right? It just happens Taiwan is near, right? I think this is what's lacking in the argument of the government, which is they keep on saying it's not about Taiwan. But then what is it about, right? Then it is about domain awareness, whether it's the Luzon Strait, Bashi Channel, whether it's the Philippine Sea. Yeah.
I was in Bugay. The mayor of Bugay was telling that UP has a reserve
for branch?
No. Reserve property there.
Right.
It can be used for marine for scientific purposes. So you can welcome the academe also in those,
scientific community.
So it's not only about the defense and security. You have also the academia here.
So in short, Cagayan now is put on the map. Maybe not for the best reasons for some of the critics, but for a lot of people perhaps would argue now is the time for Cagayan to also, bring in investments, but also bring in more development in general, which goes beyond online casinos or military, facilities, right? Yeah. Wow, I just realized we should have probably a different episode just on Cagayan.
And Cagayan is the territory of Enrile.
Exactly. And we can talk about also Secretary ba tawag sa kanya, legal advisor ngayon, di ba, of Enrile, former Secretary of Defense Enrile. I'm sure there are many voices in Cagayan. I'm glad that you mentioned the diversity of voices, even among different mayors in different locations, because everyone is just quoting the governor, right? Who some would say is somehow openly pro-Beijing. So, but now that you see diversity of views, it kind of gives an understanding that I think more consultation has to be done.
Right.
I think a more holistic multi-dimensional development has to come into being.
Agree.
And to be honest, I think yung sinasabi ng America na 180 million, chipang lang yan. Hindi yan,
Yeah,
kulang
yeah.
yan. You need billions of dollars of
course.
investment there. And online casinos are not going to bring inclusive development. Let's also be very honest about that. So you really need something more than that.
Yeah.
So maybe this tricky situation can be leveraged for something better for Cagayan. On that note, thank you very much,
Thank
Dr.
you very much,
Cabalza. That was
Richard.
fantastic. Hopefully we can have more conversation next time, both of us in Barong. No?
Yeah.
Salamat.
Thank you.
Salamat. Thank you very much. Catch us again next week here on One News. You can also check out the long conversation on Spotify, YouTube, and Google Podcast. I am Richard Heydarian, and that is The View from Manila. We're One News, all sides, all the time.